Hello and welcome to Alden Carrow's Poetry Podcast. I'm Alden Carrow, poet, walker and author of Somerset in Verse, Exmoor to Levels in Poetry. This is a podcast for people who suspect, as I do, that the world is moving too quickly and that something quietly extraordinary waits for anyone willing to slow down, listen closely and pay proper attention to it. In every episode, I share two poems. The first is a guest poem from the wider world of verse, something that has stayed with me or troubled me or refused to let me go. The second is one of my own, drawn from the fells, the coasts, the weather and the strange beauty of ordinary days. And for your chance to win a signed copy of my new book, Somerset in Verse, Exmoor to Levels in Poetry, I invite you to suggest a future guest poem by emailing me at aldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's aldencarrow78@gmail.com. The next guest poem will come from one of you. Today we are going to the roof of a county. This week's walk takes us to the highest ground in Somerset, 519 metres of Devonian sandstone with an 86-mile view, where Bronze Age burial mounds sit beside a concrete survey pillar, and 3 ruined fire hearths sit beside both. Nothing on that summit matches anything else on it. That mismatch is the whole point. We begin, though, in Wales in the summer of 1877 with a Jesuit priest who looked at a spotted cow, a speckled trout and a patchwork of farmland and decided that the mixture itself, not the perfection, the mixture, was the thing worth praising. So pour something warm, settle in, the wind is up, the light is going, and there is poetry to be found. Before we go further, let me put this week's theme plainly, because both poems this week are built on it. The pieces slide, but the pattern holds. Hold on to that. We are going to watch it work first as praise and then as geology. Gerard Manley Hopkins is, I think, the poet this podcast has returned to more often than any other, and I make no apology for it. We've had Inversnaid, God's Grandeur and the Wind Hover on this show already, and here he is again, because he keeps writing the poem I need for the ground I happen to be standing on. A little context first, for anyone meeting him properly for the first time. Hopkins was born in Essex in 1844 into a devout High Anglican family, went up to Oxford and there converted to Catholicism, a decision that cost him a good deal, including, for a time, the ease of his relationship with his own family. He became a Jesuit priest, and on entering the order he burned his early poems, believing that writing verse was incompatible with his vocation. He called it, in his own account, the slaughter of the innocents. For 7 years, he wrote almost nothing at all. What brought him back was a shipwreck. In 1875, a vessel called the Deutschland went down in the Thames estuary, and 5 Franciscan nuns exiled from Germany drowned. Hopkins' superior remarked that somebody ought to write a poem about it, and Hopkins, who had been waiting, I suspect, for exactly that permission, did. Everything we have of his mature work comes after that moment. Pied Beauty was written 2 years later, in the summer of 1877, while he was studying theology at St Bweno's College in North Wales, the same green, wet, hill country landscape that produced several of his best-known poems. He was ordained that same year, and like almost everything he wrote, it was not published in his lifetime. Sadly, he died of typhoid in Dublin in 1889, at 44, having seen essentially none of his poetry in print. It fell to his friend Robert Bridges, who by then was Poet Laureate, to bring out the first collection in 1918, 29 years after Hopkins' death. So the poem you're about to hear sat in a notebook, unread by the world, far longer than its author was alive. 2 things to listen for. The first is the shape. Hopkins invented a form for this poem and gave it a name, a curtail sonnet, from an old word for a horse with a docked tail. A standard sonnet runs to 14 lines. This one runs to 10.5, scaled down proportionally, ending on a half line of 2 words. It's a sonnet with something deliberately cut short, which is a fairly bold thing to do in a poem about God's creation. The second is the sound. Hopkins wrote in what he called sprung rhythm, built on stressed syllables rather than regular metrical feet, drawing on Anglo-Saxon and Welsh verse. In practice, this means the poem does not tick along evenly. It clusters and gallops, and then pulls up. Listen to how many words in it are doing the same thing with their sound: dappled, stipple, tackle, fickle, freckled, adazzle. The poem is arguing for the beauty of mixture, and the noise it makes is itself a mixture. Here is Gerard Manley Hopkins' Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colour as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh firecoal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pierced, fold, fallow and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, adazzle, dim. He fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. 10.5 lines. It takes about 40 seconds to read aloud, and I've been thinking about it for the better part of 10 weeks. And here is what I find remarkable about it. Almost every religious nature poem I can think of praises creation for its order, the harmony of it, the design, the sense that everything is in its correct place. Hopkins does the exact opposite. He praises the things that do not resolve. A brinded cow is a cow with irregular streaks. Rose moles on a trout are spots that follow no pattern you can draw. Chestnuts split open on the ground, he says, like coals bursting in a fire. None of these things are tidy. All of them are marked, blotched, uneven, and that's precisely what he's on his knees about. Then, in the second half, he stops giving examples and starts giving categories, and the poem gets stranger and better. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, and then that marvellous aside, who knows how? He does not know why the world is made this way. He isn't pretending to. And then the list of opposites arrives so fast, it barely has punctuation to hold it. Swift, slow, sweet, sour, adazzle, dim. And here is the turn that gives us our theme. Having spent 10.5 lines praising things that are fickle, changeable, unreliable, never twice the same, he closes on a God whose beauty is past change. He's not resolving that contradiction. He's stating both halves of it and letting them stand. The pieces slide. The pattern holds. There is a word Hopkins coined for what he's doing here, and it's worth knowing, because once you have it, you start seeing it everywhere in his work. He called it inscape, the particular, individual, unrepeatable pattern that makes a thing itself and not some other thing. Not the general category of trout, but the specific arrangement of rose moles on this trout. Not cloud in the abstract, for the exact couple colour of this sky over this hill on this afternoon. He believed that the distinctiveness of a thing was the most sacred fact about it, and that most of us walk straight past it because we are too busy sorting the world into categories instead of looking at what is actually in front of us. I would go so far as to say that inscape is the working principle of this entire podcast, arrived at by a Victorian Jesuit 150 years before I started walking around with a notebook and researching on the internet. I want to say one more thing about the line that most people skim past, because it's the one I love best. And all trades their gear and tackle and trim. He isn't only praising the natural world, he puts human work in the same breath, the tools, the kit, the particular equipment of particular jobs, all of it as worthy of praise as the trout and the finches. That's an unusual instinct in Victorian nature poetry, and it's one reason this poem sits so easily beside a summit that has a Bronze Age cemetery, a Victorian memorial, and an ordnance survey pillar all standing within a few paces of each other. And that's exactly where we are going next. Dunkery Beacon is the highest point on Exmoor and the highest point in Somerset, 519 metres or 1,703 feet, which also makes it the highest ground anywhere in southern England outside Dartmoor. On a clear day, the view genuinely does reach 86 miles, taking in the Bristol Channel, the Welsh coast, and the Brecon Beacons to the north, and Dartmoor away to the southwest. The poem's opening claim about that sightline is not a flourish, it's the published figure. The hill itself is hangman sandstone, Middle Devonian rock laid down something close to 390 million years ago, which weathers into the loose, shattered, gritty bed the poem describes, shot through with veins of white quartz. It supports acidic soil, which is why the top of it is ling heather and gorse rather than anything taller. The wind does the rest. Constant shear across an exposed ridge keeps the heather pressed down into low interlocking mats, so that from a distance the summit looks upholstered. There are several Bronze Age burial mounds at or near the summit, and the two largest carry names that have survived for something like 4,000 years, Joni Howe and Robin Howe. That word Howe is worth pausing on. It comes from the Old Norse Hauga, meaning a mound or a barrow, the same root that gives us Howe in place names right across the north of England. And what strikes me is this: a Bronze Age grave on a Somerset hilltop is speaking a language that arrived 1,000 years after it was dug. That layering, the Norse word sitting on top of the Bronze Age burial, sitting on top of the Devonian stone, is what the whole hill is doing in miniature. Nothing on that summit belongs to the same era as anything else on it. Then there's the beacon itself, which is what the place is named for. 3 ruined fire hearths sit near the summit, the remains of the signal fires that made this hill part of a national warning network. Because of its height and that 86-mile sightline, Dunkery could pass a message across enormous distances at the speed of a lit fire. That's what a beacon was for, infrastructure, not sentiment. And beside all of it stands the triangulation pillar and a memorial cairn, raised to mark the moment in 1935 when Sir Thomas Ackland, Colonel Wiggin and Alan Hughes gave the hill and the wider Holneycote estate to the National Trust, which is why the summit of Somerset now belongs, in effect, to everyone. So, a Bronze Age cemetery, a Norse word, 3 fire hearths, a Victorian descended estate memorial, a concrete survey pillar, and a braided mess of modern footpaths, all inside a few dozen paces of each other. Nothing on that hilltop belongs to the same century as anything else on it, and every single element of it is being pushed slowly downhill by water freezing in the rock. So here is my poem, Dunkery Beacon. At 519 metres, the 86-mile sightline reaches from the Brecon Beacons to Dartmoor without a scale anchor. Wind sheer strips the ridge, suppressing the ling heather to low, interlocking mats across a loose, shattered bed of hangman grits and fracturing veins of white quartz. Decades of boot soles have stripped the fibrous peat. Walkers step wide of the wet depressions, braiding parallel tracks through the gorse, working the exposed gritstone down to dust. Beside the triangulation pillar, a prehistoric cemetery holds the highest ground. 5 round mounds, Robin Howe and Joni Howe, echoing the Norse hauger. They weather beside the unwrought squares of 3 ruined fire hearths that held the signal grid and gave the beacon its name. Moist air from the channel hits the slopes and condenses, an orographic fog that shrinks the horizontal plane to 10 metres of white mist. Saturated peat slumps under its own sheer weight. A waterlogged soil creek pushes the shattered rock, the signal hearths, and the Bronze Age dead a fraction down the hill, slowly lowering the roof of Somerset. This brings me at last to an exciting announcement I've been circling for weeks. Somerset in verse, ex morta levels in poetry is finished, and it will be available in paperback on Amazon from the 3rd of September this year. There are no pre-orders. You will simply be able to find it on the day. Dunkery Beacon, the poem you've just heard, is the second poem in that book, a 100-mile descent that ends near the other end of the collection at a Bronze Age village built on a floating island of clay in a marsh. I want to tell you honestly what this book is, because it's not quite what the earlier volumes in this series were. I didn't set out to describe Somerset. I set out to understand what I was standing on. The book began on a Mendip hillside, at a single outcrop of limestone that held 400 million years of pressure, and the realisation that I had walked over it perhaps 100 times in my head without seeing it once. Every place in the book started from that same question. What is underneath the familiar, and what slow force put it there? So I read the ground before I wrote it. I traced the hematite through the bedrock, the tide across the estuary, the peat closing over a Neolithic trackway. I let the geology and the history speak first. What came out is a book of attention rather than nostalgia, and the hope behind it is simple, that you will never again cross this county or your own without looking down. Somerset turned out to be amazing ground for that. It's a county built on a long argument between water and land. A 12-metre tide resets the coastline twice a day. Rivers run in perched embankments, held above the surrounding fields by earthworks and puddled clay. Water has to be pumped upward against its own weight just to keep the fields dry. And the poems keep returning to the fact that the floodwater has no malice in it and the rock has no intention. They simply outlast the pumps. One poem follows a village that becomes an island every winter, where a pottery kiln is still fired every 2 months while the water rises past the depth markers. Another describes the largest timber monument in the British Isles, invisible because it survives entirely as 400 columns of soil where the posts rotted away. Steart the Marshes gets its own poem, one about engineers cutting a 200-metre breach in an embankment and letting the sea in, turning flooding itself into infrastructure. Bath appears too, with rain that fell 10,000 years ago, still surging up through a fault of 46 degrees, indifferent to every god we have dedicated it to. And there is the lake village near Glastonbury, where hurdles have been pressed flat by the weight of the marsh, and haven't rotted in 2,000 years. The range runs from Exmoor's Heights to the Drowning Levels. From Iron Age hill fort to working reactor, it's meant to be read as a map of pressures rather than a map of roads. And I should say too that this volume marks a shift in the series. North Yorkshire, Cumbria and Cornwall carried a more lyrical cadence. They were, in places, more willing to be beautiful about things. Somerset is harder edged. There is less mortar of sentiment in it. The language is treated more like masonry, the heavy, specific, correct names of things, laid one on top of another and left to hold their own weight. Whether that's an improvement isn't really for me to say, but it's honestly where the work has gone, and I would rather tell you that plainly than have you open it expecting the earlier books and find something colder waiting. And a word on this series for anyone new here. British Counties in Verse is an ongoing county-by-county walk across Great Britain. Cumbria, Cornwall and North Yorkshire are already out and available to buy at Amazon. Somerset arrives in September. Northumberland, coast to Cheviot, is already in progress for March of next year. Now, how you can help if you would like to. The honest position is this: I have no publisher's marketing budget behind me. What this book has instead is you, the people who listen to this podcast and who care about this sort of attention being paid to places. That is genuinely the whole engine. So 3 things in ascending order of effort, and none of them obligatory. The first is simply to remember the date, the 3rd of September. There are no pre-orders to place, no lists to join, just a date and the book will be there. If you have ever thought about picking up one of these volumes, launch week is the moment it matters most, because early sales are what tell Amazon's systems that a book is worth showing to strangers. The second is a review. I know that reviews are the thing everybody asks for, and almost nobody does. But for a book like this one, no marketing spend, no shop window placement, a handful of honest reviews in the first fortnight does more work than anything I could pay for. It doesn't need to be long, 2 sentences is plenty, and it doesn't need to be uncritical. An honest review is worth far more than a kind one. The third, and the one I would value most, is a recommendation to one person. Not a broadcast. One person, the friend who walks, the relation who lives down there, the colleague who once told you they used to read poetry and stopped. That single, specific handover is how almost every reader I have has arrived. And if you're not in a position to buy a book right now, please don't give it a second thought. Listening to this podcast is the thing, it always was. I will have much more on Somerset in the weeks ahead, including a launch week episode at the end of the month. For now, just hold on to the date, the 3rd of September. And so now we come to the end of another walk together. We have stood in a Welsh summer with a Jesuit priest praising a spotted cow, a speckled trout, and the gear and tackle of ordinary working trades, a poem that finds God not in perfection but in mixture. and we have stood on the roof of Somerset, where a Bronze Age cemetery, a Norse word, 3 ruined signal fires, a Victorian memorial and a concrete survey pillar all share a few dozen paces of gritstone, and every one of them is being pushed a fraction downhill by water freezing in the rock. Nothing on that summit matches, nothing on it is always still, and it's unmistakably one place. The pieces slide, the pattern holds. Before I go, one small thing, and I promise it will stay small, because this isn't that kind of show. If these walks are becoming part of your week, the surest way not to lose them is to follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening now. It's free, it's quiet, and it means the next episode finds its own way to you every Wednesday morning, without you having to remember. If the show has given you something, following it is the simplest way to make sure it keeps doing so, and it helps other quiet souls out there reaching for exactly this, to find their way here too. And now it's time for our competition. If there is a poem you would like featured in a future episode, a classic, something modern, or a personal favourite you have carried with you for years, please email me at oldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's oldencarrow78@gmail.com. Every suggestion will be entered into the draw for a signed copy of Somerset in Verse, Ex Morta Levels in Poetry, which will be sent to you by hand. The next guest poem will come from one of you, which is, I suppose, its own small argument for mixture, a show made of dappled things, counter and original and strange, assembled out of whatever you happen to send me. So thank you for listening, for slowing down with me, and for paying attention to ground that has never once asked to be noticed. Until next time, may you find poetry waiting for you in the everyday, and I shall speak to you again on Wednesday.